Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 7th Annual Conspiracy Con. Thank you for being here. This is our 7th event. It's Memorial Day weekend 2007. It is my honor to introduce our next guest. He has spoken here once before, about 4 years ago. His name is Jerry E. Smith. Jerry has been a writer, editor, and activist for nearly 4 decades. In the early 90s, he was the executive director of the National UFO Museum in Reno, Nevada. His bibliography of published works includes scores of articles and reviews. This is very true. Over a dozen ghost-written books, and the nonfiction work Weather Warfare. That's his most recent book and the topic of his presentation today. This is a follow-up to his previous book called HAARP, The Ultimate Weapon of the Conspiracy. That is what he spoke on 4 years ago. This is a follow-up. He also wrote Secrets of the Holy Lance, co-wrote that with George Picard, who wrote Liquid Conspiracy. Again, his presentation, Weather Warfare. Jerry's going to cover the history of weather modification from the rainmakers of the 1890s to today's suspected ability to manipulate hurricanes. When you think of what happened at Katrina, did we really fail? Or did we, at least the shadowy parts of our government, did they succeed? He will cover the 2004 tsunami, as mentioned, the possibility of earthquakes on demand today, along with the dismal failure of the UN treaty prohibiting the hostile military/terrorist use of environmental modification. He will also include an update on HAARP and its possible connection to the Space Shuttle Columbia crash. Interesting take there. Jerry will finally examine claims of an even greater threat that chemicals, or chemtrails as we know them to be, are being deliberately injected into our atmosphere, and you can see this with your eyes. Just tilt your head up and look, and there they are. Jerry's going to cover a lot of that and more. I am very excited. Please give a warm welcome to our next speaker, Jerry E. Smith.
I'm reminded of the words of Robert Kennedy, who walked into a room and said, "Gee, it's nice to see so many adults." Okay, this speech is based on 2 of my previous books. The new one is Weather Warfare, the Military's Plan to Draft Mother Nature, which, as he said, is a follow-up to HAARP, the Ultimate Weapon of the Conspiracy. Those of you who are familiar with HAARP, and I'm hoping it's most of you, know that the first book on the subject, actually the first major, thank you. It was annoying me anyhow. The first major book on the subject was Angels Don't Play This HAARP by Nick Begich and Gene Manning. And they did a fine job of covering what, where, when, how, but left out who and why. And I tackled who and why in HAARP, the Ultimate Weapon. And I have to admit that book is highly speculative. And that book, I guess, as to if HAARP can do these things, who would want to do that? In Weather Warfare, I decided to go back to the way Nick and Gene did it, and it's 400 pages of what I can prove. As such, it is very data-rich. I cannot possibly, in the next 90 minutes, begin to cover the 400 pages in Weather Warfare. Between these 2 books, there are about 650 pages, and if I'm lucky, this talk will be about 650 sentences. I begin the book, Weather Warfare, with a quote from United States Secretary of Defense William S. Cohen. Cohen wrote, Cohen was speaking at a conference on terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and U.S. strategy in 1997. He delivered the keynote address and then did a Q&A. And in the Q&A, he said, "Others are engaging, even in an eco-type of terrorism, whereby they can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. It's real, and that's the reason we have to intensify our efforts." Weather Warfare is a 400-page examination of whether or not that statement was a true statement. I concluded that he was telling the truth, and it wasn't a matter of others had this technology. He knew the others had the technology because we, our own bad selves, have it. Another quote I follow that with is from Zeebig, who was presidential national security advisor to Jimmy Carter. And Zeebig wrote a blockbuster book that should be read by all of us, just under the title of Revelation of Method. He reveals where he thinks the bad guys should take us. It's called Between Two Ages, and he calls for what he calls a technotronic era. He firmly believes that there should be a elite ruling the world, and describes what a wonderful world it will be when they take over. And one of the things he commented on was that not only have new weapons been developed, but some of the basic concepts of geography and strategy have been fundamentally altered. Space and weather control have replaced Suez and Gibraltar as key elements of strategy. And so one of the threads throughout weather warfare is an examination of this question of, has weather control really become a key element of national strategy? One more quote that I thought was rather telling was from an amazingly early book. This book came out in 1967, and as we will discuss, weather was actually being used as a weapon of war at the time that Daniel S. Halsey wrote a book called The Weather Changers, in which he wrote, "If man can modify the weather, he will obviously modify it for military purposes. The idea of clobbering an enemy with a blizzard or starving him with artificial drought still sounds like science fiction. But so did talk of atom bombs before 1945. When I was a child, I learned of the Manhattan Project that gave us the atom bomb, and I realized very early on that if something can be made into a weapon, it will be made into a weapon. So the question is, do we have control to some degree over the weather, and can that control be used as a weapon? And so, as Brian said, I give the history of weather modification up to the present. And this next slide didn't come out quite as, sorry about that. Mankind has always had a keen interest in controlling the weather. As you know, the rain dances not only have been ongoing throughout all of human history, but are still ongoing today. Rain dances are still performed in Ethiopia and in Nevada. The earliest approach to scientifically nail this actually goes back to the U.S. Civil War. During the Civil War, it was noted that great battles were often followed by great rainstorms. And this is what I was apologizing about. The picture on the left is missing. It's a poster from one of the rainmakers of the 1890s. Was appearing at the State Fair in Goodland. The one that you do see is General Daniel Ruggles. General Ruggles was a Confederate general who led an artillery battery. After the war, he was welcomed back into the bosom of the Union Army. He conceived of one of the many theories as to explain why great battles were followed by great rainstorms, and he came up with the concussion theory. Now, the concussion theory was tested and, oddly enough, proven by the United States. By 1890, the subject of artificial rain had obtained considerable dignity. General Ruggles received the very first patent for making artificial rain. This gives you an idea. The military have been involved in this literally since day one. In 1890, the United States federal government allocated $20,000 to test General Ruggles' theory. They sent a team to the staked plains of Texas where they simulated a battle and produced rain. And the United States government then gave the stamp of approval that artificial rain can be made. And this launched the wave of rainmakers of the 1890s. In the early 1890s, 93, 94, 95, the Western Plains, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas were withering under a drought. And a veritable army of rainmakers turned up, and many of them succeeded in making rain. Now, of course, the mainstream media was very skeptical, and the mainstream scientific community was very skeptical. And there were some problems legally that are still unresolved 130 years later. If I make it rain where I am, and you live downwind of me, and it doesn't rain where you are, did I steal your rain? Do you have standing against me? How much of your rain did I steal? How much do I owe you? These issues have been in the United States courts for 130 years and are still unresolved. Now, the modern era of rainmaking really begins with Dr. Bernard Vonnegut. Dr. Vonnegut was the little brother of famed novelist Kurt Vonnegut Jr. It was Dr. Vonnegut who discovered that silver iodide is the perfect substance for nucleating atmospheric moisture, that you make tiny particles of silver iodide in the air, atmospheric moisture attaches itself to it, grows large enough to fall as rain, and so you get artificial rain. NOAA has been intimately involved in this from its inception. I always thought it was hilarious that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's name is pronounced NOAA, as in the guy who survived the floods. One notable expenditure occurred in 1967 when the U.S. passed the Magnuson Bill. This authorized the Secretary of Commerce, and NOAA is one of the bureaucracies within the U.S. Department of Commerce, to accelerate programs of applied research, development, and experimentation in weather and climate modification. The U.S. government, the federal government, allocated $12 million in 67, 30 million the next year, 40 million the next year, and expected to be allocating around 150 million by 1970. At the same time, by 1970, experiments had been successfully conducted in weather modification in some 22 countries, including Argentina, Australia, Canada, Iran, Israel, Kenya, Italy, France, South Africa, Congo, and the USSR, as well as the USA. There were airborne programs to combat drought undertaken in the Philippines, Okinawa, Africa, and Texas. Fog clearing had become standard operation at airports. Hail abatement had proven successful. They'd used cloud seeding to put out forest fires in Alaska. By 1973, there were 700 degreed scientists working full-time on environmental modification. In 1976, the United States federal government outlined 50 experimental programs, funded 20 actual programs, and expended $100 million that year. And then it all changed. In 1978, the United States became signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. That treaty is now the law of this planet. It is a crime against humanity to engage in an activity that manipulates natural forces, creating such things as droughts, storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, that have widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects. The NMOD treaty is an absolute dismal failure. It is unenforceable in any real sense. It is regularly violated, and the violators get away with it simply because only 70 nations have signed on to it, and the way the thing is written is you are protected by it and bound by it if you sign it, and if you don't, you're not. And most of the world's nations have decided not to sign on. Some examples of this are Saddam Hussein. You may remember Gulf War I. You remember why we had Gulf War I? The Kuwaitis were slant drilling into an Iraqi oil field and stealing Iraq's oil. Iraq could not get the world community to smack the Kuwaitis around, so he asked the U.S. Ambassador April Gillespie if the U.S. had a problem with him smacking them. Gillespie said, no, we consider this an internal affair. So he went over and he smacked the Kuwaitis, who apparently promptly bought us as mercenaries to smack him back. On his way out, remember the problem was they were slant drilling into his oil, so on the way out he burned all the Kuwaiti oil wells that were slant drilling into him, some 700 wells. This was an outrageous environmental affront, and meteorologists around the world said there would be hell to pay for this, and they were dead right. Because of all that smoke nucleating atmospheric moisture. The monsoon seasons came on early in Southeast Asia, and a record-setting monsoon hit Bangladesh. Bangladesh, I believe the average altitude of the country is 20 feet. They had a 40-foot storm surge. There were 2.5 million people in trees, and 100,000 people were killed. This was not a violation of the NMOD treaty because neither Bangladesh nor Saddam Hussein had signed on to it. Now, come back here, you. Weather as a weapon. Weather as a weapon is absolutely guaranteed it did happen. This is Project Popeye in Vietnam. Over the course of the program, silver iodide was dispersed from C-130s, F-4 Phantoms, and Douglas A-1E Sky Raiders into the clouds over portions of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, winding from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. It began as a pilot program in '67. After initial success, they ran it and they continued running it. Overall, the program ran for 8 years. They expended more than 47,000 units of cloud seeding material over 4 countries. 2 of them were neutral, and this was violation of international law, at a cost of about $21.6 million. After the operation ended, the U.S. Air Force announced that, quote, weather modification has little utility as a weapon of war. That's obvious nonsense. What you see on the screen here, the Air University has been regularly tasked to look into the future and come up with what it would take for the United States to be the dominant air and space power in the future. One of the first ones was Spacecast 2020, and they wrote in a section on counterforce weather control for force enhancement. They wrote, atmospheric scientists have pursued terrestrial weather modification in earnest since the 1940s, but have made little progress because of scientific, legal, and social concerns, as well as certain controls at various government levels. Using environmental modification techniques to destroy, damage, or injure another state are prohibited. However, space presents us with a new arena. Technology provides us new opportunities, and our conception of future capabilities compels a re-examination of this sensitive and potentially risky topic. The Spacecast 2020 was superseded by the now infamous Air Force 2025. Air Force 2025 was again done by the Air College. It was 41 separate white papers looking at a wide variety of future war application scenarios and problems. And one of the papers that they did was Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025. In that paper, they said, the influence of weather on military operations has long been recognized. During World War II, Eisenhower said, in Europe, bad weather is the worst enemy of air operations. Some soldier once said, the weather is always neutral. Nothing could be more untrue. Bad weather is obviously the enemy of the side that seeks to launch projects requiring good weather, or the side possessing great assets, such as strong air forces, which depend upon good weather for effective operations. If really bad weather should endure permanently, the Nazi would need nothing else to defend the Normandy coast. Clearly, weather plays an important role. The question really is whether weather can be controlled, whether that can be made to work for the DoD because of these technical, legal, and political problems. Operation Popeye first appeared in the public consciousness when columnist Jack Anderson revealed it in his Washington Post column in March of 1971. Senator Claiborne Pell was outraged by the allegation and called an investigation, called in Defense Secretary Melvin Laird. Laird lied to Congress. Laird told Pell's committee, no, what Anderson is saying is just nonsense. Of course the United States would never do anything like that. But 2 years later, in 1974, a private letter from Laird got leaked to the press, which revealed that Popeye was real and that he had lied to Congress. This really set off Pell, and Pell managed to get Congress to agree to hold a secret session. Now, Laird was no longer Secretary of Defense in '74. He had gone over to being private legal counsel to Richard Nixon, who was fighting for his political life in the aftermath of the Watergate break-ins. But they did manage to get some guys from the Pentagon to come over to Capitol Hill, and on the grounds that it was a secret meeting, they spilled their guts about what was going on with Operation Popeye. Pell then was shocked, I mean absolutely overwhelmed by what he heard from them, and demanded to know what else the DoD was doing. And he got from them a laundry list of crazy things that DoD scientists were working on, including intentionally melting polar ice caps and intentionally thinning out the ozone layer over the enemy so as to sicken the enemy population through increased exposures to solar radiation. Pell then went on a crusade to create the ENMOD treaty that we mentioned, that we looked at earlier. Pell wrote, "Apart from the sheer horror of the prospect of unbridled environmental warfare, there is, I believe, another compelling reason to ban such action. We know, or should know by now, that no one nation can maintain for long a monopoly on new warfare technology. If we can develop weather warfare techniques, so can and will other nations. Experience has taught us that the weapons that make us feel secure today will make us feel very insecure indeed when our adversaries possess the same capabilities." And of course, we saw this with the atom bomb. When we were the only nuclear power, we were fat and happy. And when the Soviets and the Chinese got it, we got really scared and spent an awful lot of time practicing duck and cover. A curious thing happened on the way to signing this. The U.S. Nixon proposed it to Leonid Brezhnev at a summit they had. Before there were supposed to be some meetings to work out a group, a combined presentation to the UN. The Soviets presented their own version of the bill to the UN, which really pissed off the Nixon, because it looked like the Soviets were leading the charge to defend the world against American weather warfare. Eventually, they did work out a group bill that was passed and is the law we have today. This is from Air Force 2025. This is a table of things Air Force 2025 recognizes that we can do that violates the spirit of the ENMOD treaty without violating the letter of it. The American environmental movement was against the ENMOD treaty because they believed correctly that the threshold of severe, widespread, long-lasting was too high, and that the allowing nations to develop this technology, it was believed in the treaty process, it was believed that this technology could benefit mankind. If we could control the storms or relieve droughts, this would be good for us. And so they allowed the technology to be developed. And the American environmentalists were going, no, wait a minute, if you allow them to develop the technology, they will, and of course it will be used as a weapon. And so this is a table from Owning the Weather in 2025 that lays out some of the things you may be able to do with the weather that doesn't violate the severe, long-lasting, or widespread threshold. Now, after we signed, after the United States signed the ENMOD treaty, the federal budget I was telling you about, 1970, $100 million, went to zero. Uncle Sam just said, "Oh, can't do that anymore." Oh. No, it all went to black budget. It all went off budget. One of the primary ways it went off budget is to go to what we hear a lot about today, civilian contractors. This Weather Modification Incorporated in Fargo, North Dakota is one of the leading civilian contractors in weather modification today. In 2005, hilariously, One of the senior scientists at Weather Modification Incorporated went on Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM and outed himself as having been one of the senior scientists on Operation Popeye. Pure civilian contractor in open. I want to give you a quote from this book. This book came out in 1968. One of the chapters in it is How to Wreck the Environment by Dr. Gordon J.F. MacDonald. Dr. MacDonald was one of America's leading scientists at the time. He was the Associate Director of Geophysics and Planetary Physics at UCLA. He was on several White House advisory panels. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and that should ring some bells with you. And he was also a member of the Jasons, and the Jasons is probably the highest level military think tank in the U.S. They are very secretive. They are associated with the MITRE Corporation. The MITRE Corporation is a not-for-profit R&D company that does mostly military R&D. The MITRE company did the hopelessly flawed environmental impact study on the HAARP project, which we'll get to in a bit. Dr. MacDonald wrote, "Technology will make available to the leaders of the major nations a variety of techniques for conducting secret warfare. Techniques of weather modification could be employed to produce prolonged periods of drought or storm, thereby weakening a nation's capacity and forcing it to accept the demands of the competitor." Elsewhere, he wrote, "Such a secret war need never be declared or even known by the affected population. It would go on for years, with only the security forces involved being aware of it. The years of drought and storm would be attributed to unkindly nature, and only after a nation was thoroughly drained would an armed takeover be attempted." You may have heard that the Chinese are promising good weather for the Olympics. Business Week magazine in 2005 reported that China has 35,000 people engaged in weather management, and it spends $40 million a year on alleviating droughts or stemming hail that would damage crops. China is upwind of North Korea. China has been aggressively modifying the weather over China for more than a decade, and North Korea has been in a drought for more than a decade. China has been stealing North Korea's rain. Now, is this a case of just being a bad neighbor? Oops, sorry. Or is this a weather war, a secret weather war between the Chinese and the North Koreans? The Chinese have succeeded in keeping the North Koreans on a very short leash, forcing them to accept the political dictates of the Chinese government and to purchase Chinese food. With 6 million, you get egg roll. Now, we have noticed that the North Koreans seem to be crazy. I mean, not just Kim Jong-il, who's so lonely, but the whole damn country seems to be completely whacked out. Could this be intentional? Could their insanity be induced? And one of the ways that this insanity might be induced is a project some of you have probably heard of, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. What is HAARP? As you can see from the picture there, HAARP is a field of antennas on the ground. It is now the world's largest radio broadcasting station. It is currently capable of injecting 3.6 million watts of radio frequency energy into a spot at the very top of the atmosphere called the ionosphere. HAARP, as you can see, is in the southeastern corner of Alaska. Everything south and east of HAARP is the nation's largest national park. Wrangell St. Elias National Park is 14 times the size of Yellowstone, and yet most Americans have never heard of it. Notice next to HAARP is Fort Greely. Fort Greely is 26 miles away. For a short while, the Department of Homeland Security had its own missile base. That was Fort Greely. Fort Greely was a decommissioned Army base that when the incoming Bush folks came in, they were very keen on this shoot a bullet with a bullet anti-missile missile defense system. And initially, they took possession of 5 interceptor missiles and put them at Fort Greely and put Homeland Security in charge of them. Somebody at the Pentagon thought that was a really dumb idea. When they got 17 interceptor missiles, they moved Fort Greely back to DoD control and put it back under its own missile command, under the military as opposed to the civilians. Notice also there's something called Poker Flat and High Pass. High Pass is a great deal like HAARP. They are both something called ionospheric heaters. They're both designed to inject large amounts of radio frequency energy into the top of the atmosphere, which does a number of things. When you inject that much energy into the ionosphere, in HAARP's case, 3.6 million watts in a space about 12 miles across by about 2.5 miles deep by 50 or 90 miles up, this heats the atmosphere by several thousand degrees, which quite literally blows the molecules of the atmosphere apart. Now, when the molecules are blown apart, they give off a release of energy which includes a stream of ELF, extremely low frequency radio waves. And this ELF comes back to Earth and penetrates deep into the Earth and deep into the sea. And one of the things that got me excited about HAARP, and excited in a very negative way, was the discovery that this ELF was exactly the same frequency that the human brain works at. And I think I'll be coming back to that. People want to know who runs HAARP. Well, the work on the ground is being done by students and professors at the University of Alaska. HAARP is has a management committee composed of the U.S. Army and the U.S. Department of the Navy and the Department of the Air Force. It's on land owned by the DoD. In 2000, the incoming Bush administration stripped the funding for the project. I heard stories that the engineers at the HAARP site found themselves sitting at their desks, drumming their fingers and grousing about nothing to do because they couldn't get fuel to fill the tanks, to run the generators, to run the transmitters, to do anything with their little toy. In 2002, that all changed. HAARP drew up a memorandum of understanding with DARPA, and DARPA took over the project. I like to think of DARPA in these light. You remember the James Bond movies? There was the guy Q who built all the crazy gadgets for Bond. Now imagine Q having a budget in the billions and tens of thousands of employees. That's DARPA. This is a graphic from DARPA. This is an official U.S. government graphic showing what DARPA plans to do with HAARP. This came out about 95, 94, right in there. Now, DARPA finished building HAARP. It took 15 years. When DARPA came in 2002, HAARP was only a developmental prototype, and I'll show you some photos of it here in a moment. It was only 48 towers, had an effective radiated power of 960 kilowatts. Now, it has an effective radiated power of 3.6 megawatts. This is a list of what they say they've done with it. They finished building it probably late in 2005, announced it is finished in 2006 on their website. And this is what they say they have completed with HAARP. Notice that first one, the first numbered bullet, actually has two very different things in it. Because of I'll explain this in a moment. They say they created the generation of extremely low frequency, very low frequency radio waves for submarine and other subsurface communication. This is the ELF stream. That has been used to communicate with deeply submerged submarines for about 15 years now. And the reduction of charged particle population in the radiation belts to ensure safe spacecraft systems operations. When you blow the molecules of the atmosphere apart, that changes them into a gas, an electrically charged gas called a plasma that goes out into space. And it keeps going out into space until it runs into something to stop it, like a passing spy satellite, Spaceship Columbia, or the Earth's magnetic field. It gets trapped between the magnetic lines of force, spreading out, forming a shield. Here are some pictures of it. That big white building is the power plant. The project began, this property began its life as an over-the-horizon radar system. And that big white building was going to hold 2 giant diesel generators to power the over-the-horizon radar. They never got the OTHB system to work and abandoned it before they got the generators in. After they had the developmental prototype on HAARP up and running, they found one of the generators in a warehouse in Anchorage and put it in. So now half the building is a power plant and the other half are offices. Here you see them on the ground. Those little buildings are tractor trailers that have been converted into into shelters for the radio transmitters. You see those towers. Each tower is 72 feet tall with 2 cross dipole antennas at the top. What HAARP does is that it uses a unique patented ability to focus the radio waves coming off those antennas so as to link the field together into one giant antenna. And in regular radio, you have regular antenna, the energy goes away dispersing in a cone. What HAARP does is it spins, and the radiation, the radio instead of going out, goes around and actually focuses, and the cone is inverted with the big side on the ground and the small side at the top of the atmosphere. This is the developmental prototype. This is the 48 towers and the shelters under them for the radio transmitters. Another view of the temporary control offices that were up until they found the power generator and got the power plant up and running. Another view, the northern lights over the field. Another close-up. Now, HAARP grew out of Star Wars. Let me get the quote here. Oh, here we go. On 23 March 1983, President Ronald Reagan called upon, quote, the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. And that's what Star Wars, that became known as the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, aka Star Wars in the popular press, and that is really what HAARP was all about. Now, let's see. This is from the original patent on HAARP. There was a team working for ARCO called, they had a wholly owned subsidiary, APTI, ARCO Power Technologies Incorporated, which changed its name to Advanced Power Technologies Incorporated to hide the guilty. They hired Dr. Bernard Eastland, and he and his team put up patented a series of 12 patents, and all 12 patents are in the back of the book, Weather Warfare, so you can look them up online and read them for yourself. The first patent is complete in the back of the HAARP book. What you see here is the Earth surrounded by the magnetic field. Those sort of horseshoe-shaped cutaway, the magnetic field, the sun is an ongoing atom bomb blowing bits of atoms, radioactive particles at us. These radioactive particles get trapped in the Earth's magnetic lines of field, and they travel. They're trapped between the lines of force, spiral around the lines of force, and bounce back and forth from pole to pole. That DoD quote, excuse me, the DARPA quote, here we go, the DARPA quote. The reduction of charged particle populations in the radiation belts to ensure safe spacecraft systems operations. When you blow the molecules apart, that plasma goes up, and it goes up until it hits the radiation belts, the Van Allen belts. They weren't discovered by Van Allen, they were made by Van Allen. During the geophysical year 1958-59, he wanted to prove they existed. Everybody knew they existed, but he wanted to prove they were there, so he set off 3 atom bombs in them. Since then, that has cost us billions of dollars and may or may not have made it possible to go to the moon. A lot of people say we never went to the moon because going through the radiation belts would kill or disable any astronauts on board. We certainly do have a problem that the radiation is rather hard on living things and electronic components, and to get out into space. To get to the moon, get to Mars and beyond, we got to go through the radiation belts, and that's a problem. Well, what HAARP has done, according to DARPA, is it has forced the radiation belts to precipitate out. By putting this plasma in, it's overburdened them and forced them to release their particles back to Earth. Call me old-fashioned, but I don't think a rain of radioactive particles into the northern regions of our world is a good idea. Another thing that DARPA said they did with it is they did the control of electron density gradients and the refractive properties in selected regions of the ionosphere to create radio wave propagation channels. They discovered that if you put enough energy into the atmosphere actually takes shapes. You can actually form shapes. You can form structures in the atmosphere, and then you can run radio waves, bounce them down those structures, creating virtual tubes and tunnels in the sky. These are called waveguides. And the last one, for me, is a total head-scratcher, the generation of optical and infrared emissions in space to calibrate space sensors. I can see heating up the atmosphere enough to glow to calibrate space sensors, but how do you get the void to glow? This one I have no clue. Now that's just what they're willing to admit to having done. That is a take of the Russian Duma. The Russian Duma is the Russian equivalent of Parliament or Congress. In August of 2002, the Russian State Duma expressed concern about HAARP. They described HAARP as a qualitatively new type of weapon. A joint commission of the State Duma's International Affairs and Defense Committees issued a communique, a report that said, quote, under the high-frequency active auroral research program, HAARP, the USA is creating new integral geophysical weapons that may influence the near-Earth medium with high-energy radio waves. The significance of this qualitative leap could be compared to the transition from cold steel to firearms, or from conventional weapons to nuclear weapons. This new type of weapon differs from previous types in that the near-Earth medium becomes at once an object of direct influence and its component. That was issued and signed by some 90 deputies and sent to everybody they could think of, the UN, the US, etc. No action has been taken. At the same time, Jane's Defense Weekly, which is the premier weapons magazine on this planet, the Jane's Defense Group are the definitive source for the history and functionality of weapon systems. Jane's says HAARP is a weapon. Nick Begich and I say HAARP is a weapon. Now, Nick Begich, I mentioned him. Nick and Gene wrote the first book on HAARP, and they had an article that appeared in Nexus, and I want to bring us back to the idea of whether or not the North Koreans are crazy because of something like HAARP. Nick and Gene quoted Brzezinski, who was quoting Dr. J.F. MacDonald. And they said, political strategists are tempted to exploit research on the brain and human behavior. Geophysicist Gordon J.F. MacDonald, specialist in problems of warfare, says an accurately timed, artificially excited electronic stroke could lead to a pattern of oscillations that produce relatively high power levels over certain regions of the Earth. In this way, one could develop a system that would seriously impair the brain performance of very large populations in selected regions over an extended period. Dr. MacDonald commented on the possible use of the destructive effects of electromagnetic fields in the environment on human health and performance, in which he suggested that the systems could be developed that would increase the intensity of electromagnetic field oscillating in quote, the spherical shaped cavity between the Earth and the ionosphere, and that these weapons could be used to seriously impair brain function in very large populations over an extended period of time. Sounds to me like HAARP, or something like HAARP, being used in North Korea. Now, this leads me to ask the question, is Kim Jong-il a true Manchurian candidate? And if so, whose is he? Okay, how much time do I have left? 40 minutes, excellent. Okay, there are some topics I want to get to. Chemtrails. Can we control hurricanes? And can we get earthquakes on demand? Where should I go first? Chemtrails. All right, chemtrails. I'm going to, and I really hate to do this, I'm going to fly in the face of popular misconception. I'm going to say something that may make several of you jump up and say, he's one of them, and run out the room. In which I'm going to tell you that I can prove that there have been thousands of intentional atmospheric releases since the 1950s. In fact, it's probably closer to hundreds of thousands of intentional atmospheric releases. Between 1950 and 1970, around the world, there were rockets fired into the upper atmosphere, approximately 180 rockets a day, releasing chemicals, and about half of them were chemical releases, and the other half were monitoring equipment to see what the chemicals did. Now, I'm also going to tell you that there are persistent contrails, and that persistent contrails are persistent contrails. Now, persistent contrails have existed for a very long time. They did not just come into existence a couple of years ago. Indeed, I have been researching this now for almost 12 years. Persistent contrails were a severe problem during World War II. They compromised the stealth and security of bomber squadrons because the bombers got high enough to leave contrails that persisted and pointed back to where they were based, and they had to take alternate routes to come home. I've gone looking for these chemtrails in old movies. The oldest movie I can find one of these trails in is Murphy's Romance, James Garner, Sally Field, the opening scene, and this is 1985. The opening scene is the vast flatness of Montana, big sky country, and James Garner is driving a pickup truck out to Sally Field's ranch, and as he's driving out across the vast flatness of Montana, there is a contrail 5 times the size of that one, filling up 2/3 of the screen from horizon to horizon. Immense thing. No, persistent contrails are not brand new. Persistent contrails are, however, the government tells you they're benign, they're not a problem, these are not the robots you're looking for, move along. They are not benign. They are a significant, major environmental problem, which only became recognized after September 11th, 2001, when we had the 3 days of no-fly. For the first time, mainstream, hindbound, head up their backside scientists got a chance to look at the atmosphere uncontaminated with condensation trails and went, my God, would you look at that? Dr. Patrick Minnis from NASA watched a single contrail that started off as just the width of a jet wing turn into a cloud bank 600 miles across by 800 miles long. One contrail. That's when it really woke up. That's when the scientific community really went, what is going on here? Now, actually, persistent contrails have been recognized as an environmental problem since the 1950s. A U.S. Army weatherman with the odd name of Appleman wrote about it extensively in 1953, suggesting that this was going to be an environmental problem that was going to have to be dealt with at some point in the future. There were several studies done in the 70s that found this problem, several done in the 80s. It sort of has been beneath the radar, if you will, up until September 11th. And then it became very obvious that something was going on. Now, one of the things they discovered in studying the effects of the 3 days of no-fly was they discovered that the temperature change between day and night was tremendously different in a chemtrail sky versus a non-chemtrail sky. That when you have a completely clear sky, no contrails in it, there's a substantial change in the temperature between day and night. But today, right now at this moment, there are 63, according to the FAA, there are 63,000 Americans in the air. One of them might be Ken Thomas. There are there are 35,000 flights a day. There are 5 million flights a year. At any given time, North America, 20% of North America is covered in a white haze caused by persistent contrails. Now, what they discovered is that the white haze prevents solar energy from getting in during the day and holds the heat in at night. The difference between day and nighttime temperatures has dropped substantially in the last 20 years. Indeed, the head of meteorology at MIT is convinced that virtually all the warming over North America in the last 20 years can be attributed to persistent contrails, not global warming. So we have a problem here. Now, there also is intentional atmospheric releases. And there are a lot of theories as to what these are, a lot of theories as to what contrails are, what chemtrails are. And some of these theories are, I'm sure you've heard a lot of them. One is that we are being secretly dosed for our own good. We're being vaccinated by our government to defend us against terrorists should they try some nasty biological attack on us. I can't really say my opinion of that in public. But let me point out to you a little bit of atmospheric physics. The higher in the atmosphere something is released, the longer it stays in the atmosphere. You may remember 2003, I believe it was, the western third of the United States was covered in a white haze. I live in Reno, Nevada, we had whiteout conditions where you could not see the end of the block for 3 days. This was caused by a dust storm in the Gobi Desert that got enough dust up into the jet stream to blow it to North America. And there was white haze seen from Calgary, Canada to Phoenix, Arizona, from the Pacific to the Rockies. Now, when Mount Pinatubo went off, the ash from Mount Pinatubo was injected into the stratosphere and circumnavigated the globe for 6 months. When the Chernobyl nuclear reactor went off, the first rad counters to pick it up were upwind of it because it had circumnavigated the globe around the Arctic Circle and set off rad counters in Sweden upwind of the explosion. So if they're trying to do something up there to have an effect down here, the release has to, the closer to here you get, the more effective the release. There have indeed been patents for aerosol-released vaccines, but they have been designed to be released like crop dusting at a few hundred feet to hit an area where there's an outbreak of something like Ebola that's simply too hot to send humans into. You dust them at treetop level, not at 40,000 feet. If you were to release at normal flight altitudes a vaccine while flying from Kansas City to Chicago, by the time it reached the ground, you would be vaccinating people in Poland. So the idea that it's to help us, that some sort of a vaccine is just silliness. My favorite silliness, and every once in a while for like 4 or 5 seconds I go, yes, this is it, is that the Earth is being terraformed, and they're changing our atmosphere so that when our alien overlords get here, they'll be able to breathe the atmosphere that used to be ours. Okay, what can I prove about this? I spend 100 pages on this subject in Weather Warfare. What I can prove about it is the Earth, it has been getting warmer. From 1980 to 1979, there was a serious, from 1980 to 1998, serious warming. It has flattened out a bit, and then serious warming again the last couple of years. There is general agreement the Earth is getting warmer. There is general disagreement as to what is causing it. Despite Al Gore's convenient half-truth, it is probably not greenhouse gases and cow flatulence. Though I wouldn't put it past political flatulence. What I can prove is that starting in 1979, famed famed physicist, say that 5 times fast, Freeman Dyson, proposed if greenhouse gases really were the cause of global warming, it would be an easy thing to deal with. The albedo is the measure of how much energy the Earth reflects back into space. If we simply increase the Earth's albedo, we can balance out the energy. The idea of the greenhouse gases is that these gases like CO2, et cetera, go to the top of the atmosphere and then work like the panes of glass in a greenhouse, allowing solar energy, solar heat to get in, but trapping it, preventing it from getting back out again. If we just make the greenhouse shinier, we'll stop less heat from coming in the first place. This is called mitigation. The United States has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on mitigation schemes. Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory has led the charge in this. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb and probably the character that Dr. Strangelove from the Stanley Kubrick film was based on, took point on promoting this. Dr. Strangelove, I mean Dr. Teller, wrote an article for Dow Jones for the Wall Street Journal in which he proposed putting up a sunscreen to save the Earth from global warming. Lawrence Livermore has spent more than 20 years and more than $200 million crunching numbers on mitigation schemes, and they concluded the best use of our technology, the best way to balance out this energy is chemtrails. To put shiny dust, mostly aluminum and barium, at the very top of the atmosphere to increase the Earth's albedo. Now, other scientific organizations have come on board. SRI, Stanford Research Institute, has also spent more than $20 million. Their monthly legal magazine ran an article proposing an environmental Manhattan Project, in which it would be something as big as the Manhattan Project to save us from global warming. And chemtrails was the proposal, put up shiny dust in the top of the atmosphere. Now, a number of other scientific bodies have examined this, and they've all come to the same conclusion. This might actually work. We have this technology, we might actually be able to pull this off. But, they all come to the same buts. The environmental and legal hurdles are so high, they can never do it and tell anybody about it. And that's where the paper trail ends. If you want to look this up, try Googling geoengineering. You will hit, if you try Googling chemtrails, you'll just get a lot of websites of people pointing at the sky and screaming. You try Googling aerosol operations, and you'll discover there are hundreds of organizations, government bodies, scientific agencies involved in monitoring aerosols. Aerosols is our primary component in air pollution. And there's all kinds of aerosol stuff, and there are a number of agencies putting up aerosols. Some of them do little test aerosols, little atmospheric releases to see which way they're going, and others do big ones. Now, so what I can demonstrate, what I can prove, is that there is a big piece of the world scientific body agrees chemtrails would work, but we can't do it and tell anybody about it. Now, you know, you've all recently heard about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and their report that comes out every 5 years, and it's segmented, and the first 2 segments have been released so far this year. The first one was released in February. Now, before they released the February report, a year ago, they sent a draft to the world's governments to get their responses. And the Guardian newspaper in the UK came out with a wonderful, hilarious article the week before the first IPCC report was released that dealt with the U.S. Response to the draft. And the U.S. response to the draft was to beg the IPCC to include mitigation schemes as part of how to handle global warming. And the Guardian article had the title, U.S. Response to Global Warming, Smoke and Giant Space Mirrors. The smoke, of course, is chemtrails. The space mirrors is the other major thing that the not quite so off the deep ends are looking at, is putting up giant mirrors in space, thousands of miles across, to reflect back solar energy. Another project, another mitigation scheme that I think is absolutely hilarious, and I have to mention it whenever the subject comes up, Lawrence Livermore did the numbers on this. They're convinced this would work. They promoted this. They went to a closed-door session at the White House and tried to convince George Bush to do this. build a fleet of robot sailboats that would be powered by solar power and controlled by computers that would sail back and forth across the world's oceans outside of normal shipping lanes, controlled by computers, and have on board solar collectors and solar-powered fog generators to produce vast billowing fog banks and turn the world's oceans into shiny blankets to increase the Earth's albedo. Okay, that's mostly what I have on chemtrails, is that I can prove that the world scientific bodies are seriously looking at chemtrails as global warming mitigation, and the United States government is very much behind mitigation rather than reduction of emissions through such things as the Kyoto protocols. Let me throw out an idea here. It's not in the book. I meant to put it in the last chapter, and I just ran out of time. I wanted to do an analysis of global geopolitics, and I see that there are two major teams trying to create a global government, and I call these teams the banksters and the watermelons. Now, the banksters, we all know the banksters, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the international cartels. They're trying to create a world government based on trade agreements that put the multinationals above the sovereignty of any given nation so they can continue to control individual nations and siphon the wealth into their pockets. The other hand are what I call the watermelons, because they're green on the outside and red on the inside. Communism is far from dead. These folks are collectivists, and they are altruists. And as my favorite science fiction writer, Robert E. Heinlein, said, never trust an altruist. These folks, at the core, these folks believe Western civilization is a bad idea. That the way we live our life, the consumer-driven culture we live in, is a mistake. You know, their mantra is the U.S. produces 20% of the world's resources and consumes 80% of the world's resources. This they see as a crime against the rest of humanity. These folks do not want to create a world government to control the wealth. They want to create a world government to destroy our way of life, because it's a bad way of life. It's not earth-friendly. It's not sustainable. They want to take us back to pre-industrial revolution. They want to have us taking ox carts to work. And I suppose working, making Birkenstocks for kids in India. So that's a bit of my take on what's going on here, is that the chemtrails are the feature of the day, the mitigation flavor of the day of the banksters, whereas Kyoto protocols and that sort of thing is the flavor of the day of the watermelons, because the watermelons see global warming as the pretext to create a global government that will have the police powers to to modify our behavior. Now, the problem with this is global warming may be intentional, and it may be due to chemtrails. As I said, persistent contrails seem to be increasing global warming. Some of the scientific bodies that have looked at the mitigation schemes of chemtrails have realized if you put the dust too low in the atmosphere, instead of mitigating global warming, you exacerbate global warming. It bounces back lower heat rather than bouncing back upper heat. And it may indeed be a con game inside a con game in which they are secretly saving us from global warming, and they've gotten some of the world's governments to go on board with this mitigation scheme in hopes that sooner or later the world will realize what they have to do it, and so they can get away with it, yada yada. But in fact, they are doing it too low and exacerbating global warming and actually making it hotter as the pretext to launch the watermelon green Gestapo on us. Control of hurricanes. How much time do I have left?
Roughly 15 minutes.
15 minutes, cool. Control of hurricanes is the sexy heart of weather modification. And it is an example of unintended consequences up the wazoo. The very first attempt to control a hurricane may have been successful and was an unmitigated disaster if it was. And this was Project Cirrus, 1949. Scientists from General Electric and the US Navy flew into a hurricane that was safely out to sea in the Atlantic and dropped a cloud seeding material, in this case dry ice, into the hurricane. Now, this hurricane, within minutes of them attempting to modify the hurricane, changed directions and came on shore near Savannah, leaving 1,400 people homeless and killing a couple of people. Now, how did the Navy respond to this? They slapped everything under secrecy. They screamed national security and classified all the paperwork. What did General Electric do? General Electric rounded up the lawyers who rounded up the scientists and made them told them to shut up and sit down. The head of the project, Dr. Langmuir, was absolutely convinced. He was 99% convinced that they had succeeded in steering a hurricane. It went the wrong way, but the program worked. Well, the lawyers ordered him to never, ever say that in public and to never write that. And it was never in any of his published papers. And yet, when the Navy finally declassified the paperwork a decade later, it was in the final declassified version. But the way the Navy got around that is they trotted out a peer review panel. And the peer review panel looked over what they did and said, no, 200 pounds of dry ice in a hurricane, nonsense. Nothing happened. It's just a coincidence. After that was Project Storm Fury. And many of you may have heard of Storm Fury. Storm Fury was the pet project of NOAA, and I showed you the NOAA logo earlier. Storm Fury ran from late 60s to late 80s. And Storm Fury was successful. Storm Fury's noticed that the hurricane has an eye. Their idea was to seed just outside the eye, forcing the eye to reform larger. And if you ever watched figure skaters, if the figure skater has her arm down, she goes really fast, and if she brings her arms up, she slows down. The idea here is by forcing the hurricane to reform the eye at a greater distance, it'll slow it down and slow the winds of the hurricane down. And Storm Fury was successful. They reduced the speeds of hurricanes from 15 to 30 miles an hour. But the mainstream scientific community couldn't really get behind humans having that much impact on things. And this is one of the great weirdnesses of the global warming debate. The global warming debate says that on one hand, humans are completely changing the atmosphere of this planet unintentionally, but have no power whatsoever to do anything intentionally, which I think is complete nonsense. I think let's go back. In this article, storm control. This is an article in Business Week about an article in Scientific American. The smiling fellow there, Dr. Hoffman, had spent 20 years tinkering with computer models of hurricanes. And he was convinced that his models had led him to believe that he knew how to control hurricanes, because they had had really good data sets on a number of historical hurricanes, and that by changing the data, they could figure out what you do where to make it do what. And he was dead. I mean, he was published in the lead story, the cover story in Scientific American a few weeks before on, we got it, we nailed it, we now know how to steer hurricanes. It's simply a matter of having the technology to do what we know how to do. Now, this involves satellites injecting heat into the ocean or the air around the forming low pressure system, the tropical depression, and using this control of the temperature of either the ocean or the air to steer the tropical depression. Now, according to Dr. Hoffman, we don't have that technology yet. Elate Technologies of the former Soviet Union disagreed rather violently with this. Elate Technologies, as of the middle 1990s, claimed to be able to create hurricanes on demand You may have heard about it in 1997, 98. There were massive forest fires burning out of control in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia. Elate Technologies of Russia went to Indonesia and Malaysia and said, look, we can blow them out. We can create, in that part of the world they're called cyclones, we can create cyclones on demand. We could create a giant wind and blow out your forest fires. And Malaysia went for it. Malaysia ponied up a never-released amount of money. The Russians did their magic, brought up a big wind, and blew out the forest fires. They also flattened hundreds of villages and left thousands of people homeless. And collateral damage. Has that technology, has Elate Technologies been working since? Well, one story on them that I feature in Weather Warfare is that they are stealing, right this minute, they are stealing water from Texas. They are using a technology that was toyed with by the Department of Defense in the 1950s, and then the DoD couldn't get it to work, and the Russians picked it up. And this is using ground-based platforms to ionize or deionize the air over a selected region. If you can ionize the air, you can get the dust in the air to get tackier, to get moisture to accrue to it. So what they've done is you've got a dust bowl area with lots of dust in the air. You ionize the dust. It gets covered in water moisture, falls as rain, no more dust bowl. And when Elate Technologies went into northern Mexico in 2003, northern Mexico and southern Texas had been in a drought for most of the last decade. Mexican reservoirs were at about 10 or 20%. Today, Mexican reservoirs are at 80 or 90%. And there's no water north of the Rio Grande. In fact, there have been repeated attempts by the Texans to sue the Mexicans because there are portions of the Rio Grande that don't have any water in it at all, and people are just walking across, no more wetbacks. Hey, at least the jokes are free. So I looked at a couple of other times when the Elate Technologies may have been employed. Again, we remember Gulf War I, it lasted, what was it, 56 hours? When the Allies went into Gulf War II, they expected to be in Baghdad by Wednesday. And what happened? The moment the Allied armies launched, a big wind came up and blew sand in our faces for 3 weeks. Now, I propose, and I can't prove this, so it's not in the book, because the book's only got what I can prove, damn it. But I do, off the record to you, I think Saddam Hussein went to his friends, the Russians, and said, look, can you buy me some run-in time? And they said, sure, how much do you need? Elate Technologies are a wild card in this. Again, we're talking civilian contractors. So hurricanes. Hurricanes may be steerable. Dr. Hoffman thinks they're steerable. Elate Technologies thinks they're steerable. Elate Technologies claims they can create them, and apparently they have. Now you look at the last 2 hurricane seasons, 05 and 06. In 05, we had an unprecedented number of hurricanes make landfall, and an unprecedented number of Category 5 hurricanes make landfall. If you look at the tracks of those hurricanes, they went straight from the South Atlantic into the shallow, warm waters of the Caribbean where they picked up energy, and then were blown over, many of them were blown over into the Caribbean, into the Gulf where they picked up more energy. And that's how they became Category 4 and 5s. If you look at the tracks, the storm tracks, most of those hurricanes had straight lines, except for the one that zigzagged up the Florida Peninsula, which had apparently never happened before. Now you look at Katrina. Katrina barrels straight from the South Atlantic straight on to New Orleans. And at the last possible moment, literally minutes before making landfall, it does an abrupt right turn. Hurricanes don't do abrupt right turns, leastwise not natural ones. There's a great deal of evidence that we're looking at two different teams. One team playing pool with the hurricanes shot it at us, and the other team at the last moment got a hold of it and pushed it off. There's a lot of players in this team, in this field. But I can't prove it, so I didn't put it in the book. It's 400 pages of what I can prove. Okay, where were we? Earthquakes. Okay, earthquakes. Scalar weapons. I suppose most of you have heard the phrase. If anybody in this room actually understands scalar weapons, please come explain it to me. What I understand of it, and most of this comes from the work of Colonel Tom Bearden. And Tom Bearden gave us to believe that what happened was, let me set the Wayback Machine to the 1840s. There was a brilliant British scientist, James Clerk Maxwell. James Clerk Maxwell may have discovered unified field theory. Our understanding of electromagnetism is based on Faraday and Maxwell. And Maxwell's equations are a cornerstone of modern science. They may be wrong. They may be incomplete. According to Bearden, what happened was Maxwell wrote those. They were published in 1864 in quaternion math. We don't use quaternion math anymore. In 1901, 1902, a team led by Oliver Heaviside, who discovered the ionosphere, and Heinrich Hertz, and you probably know megahertz, kilohertz. The measurement of frequency of radio waves is named after him, in honor of him. Heaviside and Hertz translated Maxwell's equations from quaternion into tensor. And according to Bearden, they buggered it. They got it wrong. They left pieces out. Now, in the 1950s, when the U.S. got the atom bomb, the Russians freaked out and went looking for some sort of science, any sort of science, that would allow them to beat us. And they went back to Maxwell in the original quaternion and went, oh, look at that. Here's something they don't have. And according to Bearden, they used Maxwell's equations, Whittaker's formulations. Whittaker was a theoretical physicist. His major publications were in 1909, 1910. He was one of the first physicists to demonstrate mathematically that multiple dimensions had to exist, that the Earth had, that the space-time continuum had to be more than just 4 dimensions. According to Bearden, they used Whittaker's formulations, Maxwell's equations, and Tesla's technology to build Tesla weapons, scalar weapons. Scalar is a term that Whittaker used to describe his phenomena of putting energy in one dimension and pushing it through another dimension and taking it back out in the first dimension, so you have, it goes from A, it appears at B, with no travel in between. You have effect without cause. That may be what scalar weapons are about, and they may have used it on a number of earthquakes. As I said, the book is about what I can prove, and I can't prove scalar, so I have a very short section on it, mostly to satisfy those of you who insist I have to have a section on scalar. And I look at what I can prove, and what I can prove is that there are about 6 different ways that we know that humans can cause earthquakes unintentionally. And my take is, if we can do it once by accident, we can do it twice on design. And the most common, the best documented, is atom bombs. Atom bombs set off earthquakes. The Department of Energy will say, "Oh no, 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 no," but we have their own documents, their own testimony on it to prove otherwise. Most famously is Project Faultless. You may know that the Nevada test site is about 90 miles outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, and while the first nuke shot was at Alamogordo, they quickly moved nuke testing to the NTS, Nevada test site, And there have been 999 nuke shots at the Nevada test site. We nuked ourselves out. Hazel O'Leary, as the head of the Energy Department, released a map showing RADs across America, and there's not a single county that is RAD-free. We have all been irradiated. Particularly Kansas and New England, because of the way the currents skip over North America. Senator Tom Harkin, his entire family have serious thyroid problems, probably because of being downwinders of the NTS. As the bombs got bigger, it kept rattling Las Vegas. Initially, Las Vegas was very small, and a part of the Las Vegas experience was going to Vegas during nuke season and watching atom bombs go off. After we signed the limited test ban treaty, the bombs went underground, and as the bombs got bigger, the building shook more. And Howard Hughes owns a number of casinos in Las Vegas, and Howard Hughes got rattled. He got really ticked off with the bombs scaring his clients and breaking his windows. And he quite literally went to the NTS and told them to knock that stuff off. And the NTS went, well, you know, if Howard Hughes says something, maybe we ought to take him up on it. And they went looking for another place to set off the big bombs. And eventually they ended up on an island in the Aleutians to set off the big bombs. But they tested a site in central Nevada, in the middle of absolute nowhere, Nevada. And it was going to be, they hoped it was going to be the new test site where they could set off the really big ones. But they had to make certain the site was okay. So they decided to put the bomb, which turned out to be the largest bomb ever detonated in the continental United States, on a fault to see if it would set the fault off. And of course, the scientists were convinced, well, humans can't set off earthquakes, it wouldn't happen. So they named it Project Faultless. Not only did it set off the fault line it was on, it set off the fault line on the other side of the valley and dropped the valley floor by 15 feet. So we have proof that humans can intentionally set off earthquakes, at least unintentionally set off earthquakes. What about tsunamis? The Asian tsunami keeps coming up as one of these big questions. Excellent. Here's a little piece of the problem for nailing this stuff down and being able to prove this stuff, is most of this stuff is classified. And it takes a very long time before a government is willing to cough up its secrets. One of the interesting pieces of coughing up that happened very recently was Project SEAL got revealed. Project SEAL was declassified, I believe, in 98 or 99. Project SEAL was an attempt to develop a tsunami bomb that succeeded. During World War II, you know, there were a lot of technologies under development, and some of them simply didn't get done in time to be used in the war, like the Spruce Goose. Well, Project SEAL was an attempt to develop a tsunami bomb. It was done by the New Zealand government. They had an Australian scientist working as the head of the project. The Australian scientist successfully tested the bomb in 1946 and 47, a little too late to be used. The US DoD went, wow, and invited the head of the project to witness the Bikini Atoll nuke shot in hopes that there would be some connection between their works. He respectfully declined, so they sent some guys from the Pentagon to his offices, and they went through his paperwork, and one of the DoD guys sent back a rather enthusiastic memorandum to the Pentagon expressing that they thought that if the tsunami bomb had been perfected in time to be used during the war, it could have played a role as great or greater than the atom bomb. And we're expected to believe that they developed the bomb and go, oh, don't need it, file it away, forget about it. It's very possible that that bomb is in somebody's arsenal. And they didn't get around to telling us about it for 50, almost 60 years. And there's an awful lot of stuff in the labs in the files, in the arsenal, they're not telling us about. And I want to conclude with simply saying, I want you to take some action, because this is your planet.